So let's turn to Exodus chapter. Any other comments, questions before we start? Exodus chapter 6. In the Chumashim, page 351. In the English version of the Chumash, Friedman's version, page 128.
Exodus 6. So you'd be able to...
What was the first page?
351.
Page 1.
I actually prefer looking at
Oh, that's not what you meant? Page 351 in the red books. Page 128 in the beige off-white books. We'll call them ivory, maybe. Ekru? Yeah, sure. White. The red books and the other books.
Very good.
I was just at my interfaith learning that I've been doing monthly, the cohort. There's about 30 clergy or so from all different backgrounds across the spectrum. And today, a reverend who works for the PICO organizing group was the speaker, and he was talking about prophetic resistance. And one of the stories that he said was his model of prophetic resistance was the book of Esther. And this is coming from a black Baptist minister. And he said that Esther for him was an example of that. To which I said that there's been a series of articles that were written this year in particular about how not only was Esther a prophet of resistance, but Vashti was as well. And that the language of the #MeToo and #TimesUp have been applied to both of them. And that Vashti's willingness to really disobey the king and not parade around naked when he wanted her to was an act of civil disobedience, if you will, that either got her banished or killed, we're not sure which one. And it may have actually been a desire on her part to distance herself from the controlling empires of the day. So in this case, a Persian king who was fairly corrupt and drunk and a party animal and had no real control over his people, and distancing herself from her ancestors. Does anyone know who Vashti's ancestors were? Nebuchadnezzar, who was the king who led the revolt for the Babylonians and destroyed the temple in 587-86. So I actually said in response to his comment about Esther that you could make the argument that Vashti, who most people kind of cast aside, was also an example of this courageous woman, a prophet of resistance, who stood up not only to the king, but also to the evil empires that existed around her and the society that she was living in. And in a way, one of the questions he asked us is, what's the story in your tradition that you think of in terms of being a prophetic story of resistance? And I said the Exodus. And in a way, Moses' moment is now. Right, in terms of coming to power, figuring out what his relationship is with God, but ultimately it's discovering his prophetic voice. We think of Moses as the prophet par excellence of the Jewish people, and the one who not only will do the leading of the people, but he'll be the person who goes before the power, if you will, Pharaoh, and gets the people out. In order to understand how he gets that power, how he becomes a prophet, we turn to chapter 6. And chapter 6 is, for those of you who may remember or may not remember, it's a reintroduction of Moses to God in a different way than we've ever had before. Up until now, what have we known God to be? Who is God? How do we know God? How we've been introduced to God?
God spoke to the patriarchs.
So God, the God of the patriarchs, God speaking directly to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. What else? Before Moses. Or even up until this point in the story, in terms of how God introduced God's self to Moses.
Is this after the burning bush?
This is after the burning bush. So the burning bush is a good answer. Yep, absolutely.
By God's act.
By God's acts, right? How else?
Well, the whole Noah story.
Say more.
Well, God picking again someone to sort of save humanity.
Okay.
I can't remember, I'm a little tired today, but how God spoke to Noah is different than the relationship being developed with Moses.
Great. Any others? What's the crux of this class that we've been talking about? Who wrote, but who in particular is the God that is introducing God's self to the particular person? Sometimes God introduces God's self as El, sometimes as Elohim, sometimes as Adonai, sometimes as El Shaddai, sometimes as the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Which God are you, God? And all of a sudden Moses, who probably also was not so sure, gets the answer. Here's the answer right here. Chapter 6. And you'll notice that we get a little bit of everything all in one because that's the Jewish way. We can't just settle on one answer. We have to throw all of them into the pot. Verse 2, Vayedaber Elohim el Moshe. So we start by Elohim speaking to Moses. Vayomer elav ani Adonai. I am Adonai. Va'ere el Abraham el Yitzhak el Yaakov. And I appeared to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob as El Shaddai. Ushmi Adonai. But I did not make myself known to them as Adonai. V'gam hakimoti et briti itam latel lahem et eretz Canaan. I made a covenant with them, establishing that I would give them the land of Canaan, et eretz mugureihem asher garu ba. V'gam ani shamati na'akat b'nei Israel. I also heard the plight of the Israelites who were reaching out from Egypt. Ma'avidim otam va'eskor et briti. And I have remembered my covenant. Lachen. And more libnei Yisrael ani Adonai. Say to them that I am Adonai. So what's our progression? Who's the first name we have? El. We'll call it El Elohim. Then El Shaddai.
Adonai.
And then? Well, you might want to say the patriarchal God. Right? Where do you want to put them?
That's right
Adonai
after.
Elohim.
Maybe we'll put it here.
Just L.
Before, yeah.
Okay, so we have El, Elohim. Somewhere in here we have the L's. Elohei Abraham, Elohei Yitzhak, Elohei Yaakov. Then we also have El Shaddai. Would you add anything? What's next?
Adonai Elohim.
Okay, good. So we may want to say Adonai Elohim. By the way, who's the God of the first creation story?
El.
El. Okay? We're making progress over here, and then we're going to get Adonai. And then along the way for Adonai, we have Adonai Elohim. And we have Ehyeh,
Where's Yud Baka?
Asher,
That's Adonai.
Oh.
Ehyeh. Which this is the Tetragrammaton. Okay? So look at our progression. Whoops, I'm sorry, Rose. All right, look at our progression from El to Elohim to El Shaddai to Adonai. Go ahead, Phil.
Don't you think Ayeh Asher Ayeh goes with Hashem?
Totally.
Adonai? Okay.
Absolutely. But before we get told in chapter 6 that my name is actually Adonai,
Oh, you're mapping this text.
I'm mapping this text out. And in particular, if we were to go back to the burning bush story, we're told not just that his name is Adonai, but that God is Ehyeh Asher Ehyeh.
Yeah.
Which, by the way, is just a variation of Adonai.
Yeah.
Does everyone know that part? Do you want me to write? So in Hebrew, Ehyeh, this verb, hey yud hey, is essentially the same thing as hey vav hey. It means to be, or to become, or a process, or something like that. So Ehyeh is actually a variation of the Tetragrammaton, if you will, in Hebrew. It's from the Hebrew word hayah. Some people may have heard the prayer, Hu hayah, Adonai, Hu hayah, Hu hoveh, Hu yihiyeh. God was, God is eternal. What were you going to say, Stan?
Chapter 2 of Genesis, the second story, is Adonai.
Right.
Adonai Elohim.
It is Adonai?
Mhm.
Okay.
Yeah.
So it's not pure, it's
That's right. In verse 4 of chapter 2 of Genesis, Eila tolot Hashemayim v'aretz v'kibaram b'yom asot Adonai Elohim eretz v'shamayim.
thank you.
Okay? So there's this weird blending of the different names of God, but Moses, I want to tell you my real name. My real name is Adonai. Not only is it my real name, look for a second, and we talked about this last time. Look at the very last word of verse 3 on page 352 in the English, in the translation. What did they do in the translation? They wrote it in Hebrew, just to make it legit, make it official.
So you're saying that up to this point, that if Adonai, which we've seen used in various chapters and various, is never used alone?
Oh no, it's definitely
It
used
is.
alone, for sure.
So
It's absolutely used alone. We have the word Adonai many times in Genesis.
Exactly.
We have Elohim many times. We have Adonai Elohim many times. We have El Shaddai a few times.
but not as many. So that's why I'm wondering about this progression, because it's used throughout.
I'm only mapping out chapter 6.
Okay.
And in mapping out chapter 6, I'm trying to make the point that somehow in God reintroducing, by the way, how many times has God reintroduced God's self already to Moses in the first 6 chapters?
Yeah.
Do we really need another introduction of God? We don't need another introduction of God. By the way, when we get a little bit further in chapter 6, you're going to see that there's almost a redundancy in the genealogy of the story that we don't need.
But this is way different because like,
Why is it different?
Can I take a 2-second digression? So unfortunately, Rabbi said this. I think
2
Adonai is an abomination. I think it's using the Lord's name in vain. It's a Greek word, and it's plural. It means our lords. It's not the singular our Lord.
Wait,
So
what? Which word is an abomination?
I personally, full think that Adonai is an abomination. It's a Greek word, and it's a plural. It's a pagan polytheistic. It would be Adoni, like Adonis. Same word, right? It means.
Oh, you're
Lord.
talking about the word that's used to
Right. To denote it.
read
Right.
that word.
And the Orthodox use Hashem.
By the way, it might make services more interesting if we said Baruch Atah abomination.
No, definitely. Okay. So, what was I saying before I did?
Hashem.
It's Greek.
So
Orthodox.
here, let me. Phil is suggesting. So this word, we don't know how to say. Every time that you say this word, you have been trained to read it this way. You have been conditioned since back in the day of religious school, right? For those of you who went to religious school or for going to shul or whatever, that the way you read this word is Adonai. But that is actually technically not correct. If you, in the Orthodox world, or the traditional world, how would you say this name? No, you'd say Hashem.
In conversation.
In conversation.
The name.
No, but even not in conversation, unless I was saying this word as a blessing, Baruch Atah Adonai,
Yes.
I would always say Baruch Atah Hashem.
Yes.
Always.
Yes.
And that's in large part because either we don't know how to say it, or because saying it would mean that we're using it for a particular purpose. And unless it's to fulfill a mitzvah, to say a blessing, whatever, you can't say God's real name. The academic term is the tetragrammaton. This is the kind of 4-letter root word that probably has some deeper meaning. If you wanted to change this into English, for example, Yud He Vav He, they each get a letter of the English alphabet. So this is Y, H, W, H. It's kind of like the same thing as transliteration, right? If I wanted to translate Baruch, I would write it this way. But there's a reason that I write it this way. It's because the Hebrew is this. Okay? So the bet is the B. The ah sound is the vowel. The resh is the R. The u sound is the U. And the very favorite letter that I love to transliterate, the chaf is CH. Right? Which, by the way, don't even get me started on Hanukkah. Especially because Hanukkah is with a chet, not with a chaf. Okay? But there's a reason why Baruch is written this way. It's following the letters and the vowel sounds. So I literally did the same thing with this. If I were to write it the right way, meaning from left to right in English, you get this. Which is why we translate Yahweh. By the way, in Latin, I think it's in Latin, the Y can also be a J. In German and in Latin, the W can also be a V. Right? So now we got Jehovah. It's all derived from the same word. Okay? Yeah.
So this is all interesting at some level, but what does it tell us about who wrote the
That's
chapter?
a good question.
Yeah.
We'll get there.
Okay. All right.
Phil, what was your, do you want to finish your
So now I
comment?
remember, so this is where Hashem is introducing himself to the people of Israel. So Hashem is the God of Israel, and that's what confuses me,
Yes,
because we don't know that in modern times,
you're right.
right?
So,
Right, because for example, Allah is Elohim, so the Muslims are Elohists, and that's not the God of Israel, but yet we talk about Elohim and Hashem like we've got two gods, but the Torah is quite clear about that. He's telling us quite clearly here that the only God of the Israelites is Hashem,
that's right.
and not Elohim.
And so that, I think, answers your question. The reason why, no, that's not. The reason why it's important to recognize that in chapter 6, verses 2 and 3, that we're going through this progression is that from a spiritual and theological perspective, don't get caught up in it being El, or Elohim, or Adonai, or El Shaddai, because the most important name that you need to know is Adonai, the Yud Hey Vav Hey. And all of these other things are appellations of how I made myself known to all of these other people. But ultimately, the most important thing that you need to know is that the God is Adonai. So that who wrote the Torah from a theological perspective? Adonai. And it doesn't matter for a moment, hold on, Stan.
Yeah.
Right? It doesn't matter for a moment how God made God's name manifest to everyone else. Because right now for Moses, the most important thing you need to know is all of these other names, they're good names too. Other people knew me by them, but I'm telling you what my real name is. And I'm going to be the authoritative God in the story going forward for you and your people. Stan, and then Julie, and then Helen.
But this is the priestly author saying that Adonai is the name.
We'll come to the JEPD in a second.
Okay.
Okay, I'm only talking about theologically.
But this is political.
I know, I'll come to the political in a second. Right, you're right, and that's what I think will complicate Barbara's answer. I was trying to just give her a simple answer for a moment. If you wanted to believe that God wrote the Torah, and you wanted to know what God's true name is as the author of the Bible, or in relationship between God and the people, it's Adonai. It's Yud Hey Vav Hey. End of discussion.
So after Exodus 6 is every reference to God? Yud Hey Vav Hey?
That would make it nice and easy.
But why, Barbara? Why would it not be? That's right. But you've just added in a different layer. I'm giving you a theological answer, and you're giving me a political, academic
But
answer.
theologically, the people who believe that, they have a problem reconciling.
They do have a problem. And there's going to be all kinds of stories. What's the classic example, we just read about it last week, of a story where, forget authorship for a second, if we just go based on the stories that are here, what's the classic example in the book of Exodus of the people wrestling with who is God?
For the golden
The
calf.
golden calf.
Yeah.
And what is it that they're building? They're building an idol that resembles a god of Egypt. By the way, where is Adonai in this story? Not present with them, up on high on the mountain. And they're struggling with the same thing. By the way, if you wanted to make an argument of where does the question who wrote the Bible emerge, it's from that story. They just got the Decalogue, the Ten Commandments, they're up on the mountain, they're waiting for Moses to come back, and he disappeared. So I'm supposed to believe in the God that's now not here? So what do? They revert back to doing something that they were familiar with, which is another God. Could be El, could be Elohim, could be some other name. So even they're wrestling with who is the author of this tradition that they've just been given.
Okay,
Julie.
so other than the political explanation, from a theological viewpoint, as you're explaining, what's the reason that God has so many names and has, presented himself, right?
That was your question?
That was like, what thing?
What's
That's
the
a
point?
great question.
Why-
Okay,
Why does
so,
God need aliases?
say it again?
Why does God need
Why
aliases?
does God need aliases?
And is it, I mean, you could go theologically thinking that there's a different persona of God. I mean, that the name is not just a name. There's something.
An aspect.
There's aspects of it, and so why are we?
So let's explore that. What are some possible reasons why we have different names of God?
Because the person who made up all this stuff, it just doesn't make any difference. Call him anything you want.
Call him anything you want. Call him late for dinner. That's fine. Oh wait, don't call him late for dinner. So that's one answer. It doesn't matter. Okay? What's another reason?
This is a compilation of many different stories.
Okay,
that are
good.
Together.
That's another answer. Give me another one.
Well, L is coming from the surrounding, and so there's characteristics of
It's
whatever.
political.
It's a
That's right. It's
political.
political. It's contextual. Give me another answer.
Oh, God has different facets to his or her personality, and so different names speak to different parts of God.
Okay, I'm glad you brought it up. I want to push you on that further.
All right.
Where does that idea come from? That God has different attributes and aspects and personalities and
The neshama,
Creation.
Neshama?
Isn't there a female part of God?
Yeah, there's the Shekhinah. Yes, that is true. Not in the story per se. We derive it later. But where does the idea come from that there are different understandings, names, attributes, whatever of God?
Maybe because sometimes God is very merciful and kind, and sometimes he's
You've got,
seems
Well,
angry
13
and
attributes.
vengeful.
Okay, that's one possibility. Stan?
yeah, I was just going to say, we just read this, the 13 attributes of God. Let me know who you are,
Yeah.
and I'll tell you who I am by these attributes.
Yes. Yes. Yeah.
There's also, you say the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. It implies almost some sort of difference there.
Yes. But now you're asking an interesting question. Is the name of God, this challenge of what we're trying to understand of who is the author of this thing, is it vertical in nature or is it horizontal in nature? By that I mean, is it God directing us from top down, bottom up, like this, and us directing God, or is it humanity directing each other and then creating some understanding of what the text is saying? I would make the argument that we actually don't know what God's attributes are. God's attributes are an anthropomorphization of God based on a human understanding of what we want God to be.
Right.
I want God to be merciful. I want God to be compassionate because I can't believe in a God that is only vindictive and vengeful and fill in the blank. Stan?
I don't should I ask a different question. Are the names of gods vertical or horizontal?
Great. By the way, you could ask that about every single name of God because every single name implies a different kind of relationship. You just named one. Wait a minute, what happened to the female aspect of God? Well, we don't know does anyone know God's gender?
Both, I thought.
I've heard that.
What did you say?
Both.
Yeah.
Most people suggest that God is genderless. Is genderless, but has attributes or features of both aspects of God. Okay, but
And so, nothing?
well, Ein Sof is actually without end or infinite, endless, as opposed to the Ayin, which is nothingness, which is a complicated one that I don't even know if I can wrap my head around. Yeah.
So theologically, I think that Genesis is a story of Elohim, which is not a name, it just means God. And then 400 years, and then Yahweh, and Yahweh displaces Elohim. And they're different gods.
I would even go a step further. I think that for people who read the Torah, they're all the same. For most people who pick up this book, and you're reading from the beginning, Elohim, El Shaddai, Adonai, Tsebaot, you pick one, we all think of them as just different ways of saying, oh, that's Richard, we also call him Dick. Right? That's Robert, we also call him Bob. It's the same thing. We don't make a distinction.
No.
The purpose of the class, though, is we're saying, no, there is a distinction to be made. There is something else going on here that's driving the reason why the author chose these names.
Yeah. It wouldn't be Rob or Bob. It would be buddy, guy, dude versus Bob.
You're sure it's not Robert, Bobby, Rob?
No, there's
Bobby?
only one proper name of Hashem, and it's Yahweh, and every other one is not a proper name. It's like
So I can imagine being in a
It's not a name.
conversation with God and saying, you know, what up, G?
what up, G?
Right?
How's it hanging?
Right? OMG, it's you, right? You know, like I can imagine that being the kind of thing. And by the way, most of the names that we have are the human understanding of what we believe God to be.
But
We
how is
call
it?
God Sivaot. What does Sivaot mean? The Lord of
Hosts.
hosts. What does that imply?
Well, host seems to be a large number of people.
Yep.
The beginning.
Everybody.
It's actually a militaristic form of God. It is the God who is like the general. It is the God that leads the army.
Like the
how-
Lord of Hordes.
Huh?
Like the Lord of Hordes.
Yeah. Does anyone know what the process was when people would go out and march in the wilderness when they would move from camp to camp?
Process?
Yeah, the process.
You mean for, in the wilderness?
In the wilderness.
They marched, they had a formation.
They had a formation.
And,
By tribes.
you know, that by tribes
Okay,
would arrange
I
around
want
the
to show you.
tabernacle.
Look in the book of Numbers. Hold on a second. I think it's chapter 7. No, it's not chapter 7. Maybe it's chapter 9. No, sorry, chapter 10. Look on page 826. Okay? You're all going to know this one. 826, chapter 10, verse 35. Whenever they were getting ready to move from camp to camp, like from their journey from one place to another place, this is the way that they marched. I'm looking at verse 35. It says, when the ark was set out, Moses would say, advance, O Lord, may your enemies be scattered, and may your foes flee before you. And when it halted, he would say, return, O Lord, you are Israel's myriads of thousands. Right? God would go to the front, almost like a general, and lead the people wherever they're going, and then God would retreat back into the camp. Now, when I said that you all know this one, because the Hebrew in verse 35 is, Vayhi minso ha'aron, vayomer Moshe, Kuma Adonai, veyafutsu oevecha, veyanusu mesanecha mipanecha. What is that?
Take out the Torah.
Right? It's when you take out the Torah. Literally, when we're taking the Torah out of the ark, we are reenacting the moment when the ark would go before the people, in particular with God on lead, and God would protect us by casting aside our enemies. And does anyone know where the verse 36 comes from?
That's right before it.
It's right before we put it away. Uvnucho yomar shuva Adonai revavot alfei Yisrael. And like 2 verses later is Eitz chaim hi lama chazikim ba. We think of God as the leader who goes out and protects us in a militaristic kind of way before we go on our next journey. That was a human understanding of what God is. It may have also been a divine understanding of what we should think God is. So there's lots of different ways of being able to think about it. But from a theological perspective, if you wanted to ascribe one name of God, the name of God that is being authored as the supreme name of God, it is the name that Moses hears for the first time in this capacity, even though other people have heard it in different ways. It's Adonai. It's Hashem, it's Yud He Vav He, it's Yahweh, it's however you want to say it.
So I'm trying to think back when we went and looked at the burning bush. God did use Adonai then?
Totally does.
That's what I thought.
Go back to the burning bush.
So-
Go back to chapter 3.
So this is, in a sense, why are we having a repetition of the introduction?
Oh, I'm so glad that you asked that question. I'm so glad. That's where we get into trouble. And that's why Barbara's question is so hard to answer. Right? Go back to chapter 3 for a second.
Page.
I'm on page 327. By the way, just for the sake of looking, if you go,
121.
huh?
Page 121.
Yeah, go back to page 121. Who is the author of chapter 3 according to Friedman?
Well, it's a mix. But
It's a mix. It's a ping pong between J and E. And if you look in verse 2, for example, first he comes to Har HaElohim, the mountain of Elohim, Vayira Malach Adonai. And he sees inside malach of Yud Hey Vav Hey. And then in verse 4, it says, Vayar Adonai Kisar Lerot. He turns away because he's there. And literally in the same thing, it says, Vayikra Elav Elohim mitoch hasneh. Elohim calls from the sneh. And then on the next page, look at verse 6, 328. Vayomer Anochi Elohei Avicha Elohei Abraham Elohei Yitzchak Elohei Yaakov. I am the Lord of your God, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Which El? We're using El here, not Adonai. And then look at verse 7. Vayomer Adonai Ra'o Ra'iti Et Oni Ami. And the Lord said, Yud Hey Vav Hey said, I've heard the plight of my people. Literally in one story we have the ping pong of all of the different names. So Ellen, you asked the right question, which is, why do we need to know it again in chapter 6? What's different about chapter 6 than chapter 3?
Well, it's clearer.
All right. Hold yours for 1 second. Say what you were going to say.
Well, this is going with all of them, and here it's like, this is it.
That's it. That's right. Theologically speaking, Moses is totally confused. He has no idea, I don't want to do this, I'm not the right person, find somebody else. He doesn't know what to do. And so God finally says again in chapter 6, you know what, Moses, let me break it down for you and make it clear. Who is the God that is the author of this story? Adonai. By the way, in the Haggadah, Moses doesn't appear. Who is the God that takes us out of Egypt? Who is the God that is the God and not a seraph and not an angel and not a whatever? It's Adonai. Adonai, Yud Hey Vav Hey, however you want to say it, Yud Hey Vav Hey, Tetragrammaton, Yahweh, whatever, that becomes the dominant narrative of who God is and who has the authority in the text. And you can make the argument, is the author of this text. From a theological perspective, it's all right here. This is the answer. By the way, the commentaries love to say that the Torah doesn't actually start in Genesis, but the Torah starts right here. It starts in Exodus when we get God's real name, crystal clear, no ambiguity, that's the name. Yeah.
Other than God or Lord or Shaddai Almighty, is there an English translation that is understandable of Yud Hey Vav Hey or Elohim?
Not really.
Well, sure. Okay.
Which may even be further proof of the answer to Barbara's question being, it's Yud Hey Vav Hey.
Right. Deal with it.
Yeah, that's essentially what he's saying. I'm in charge. Deal with it. Don't think it's any of the other gods. It's not the gods of Egypt. It's not the gods of whatever. And even your ancestors who knew me, they didn't really know me. You get to know me. I mean, it's actually a way of saying Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob didn't even really fully grasp who was the author of the story. But Moses gets to know.
So why is it a heresy to call Hashem, Elohim? Because he tells you, this is my name. It's like when somebody says, hey, what's your name? I'm Phil. And they say, hey, Flip. And it's like, well, I don't really like being called that, right? And then tell them like 50 times, this
You don't
is my
flip
name.
them off when you're done.
Yeah. But you know what I mean?
Because in the traditional, they're all just different names of the same thing.
That's the rabbinical approach.
Yeah.
They just
And each name has a different association with it.
But that's rabbinical, right?
Totally.
Yeah.
All right, I want to go back.
This is the big reveal.
This is
this
yes,
is the guy
yes.
behind
This
the
is the
green
big
curtain.
reveal.
Yeah, right.
By the way, if you think about the Decalogue, the Ten Commandments, who is the God that is the author of the Ten Commandments? It's Adonai. Anochi Adonai Elohecha. I am the Lord your God who took you out of the land of Egypt. What is Adonai's claim to fame in the Torah? What is Yud Hey Vav Hey's claim to fame in the Torah? The Exodus. You might think it was creation, but the whole purpose of this story is the Exodus from Egypt. Because what happens in the Exodus from Egypt? You become a people, and in particular, when you become a people, what do? You enter into a covenantal relationship with God.
So it's not a one covenant
No.
relationship now, it's a people relationship.
It's a people to a God relationship. And by the way, just for argument's sake, and it goes to Stan's question, look on page 128 in the Friedman book. Who is the author of chapter 6?
P,
P. What do we know about the P's?
priest.
They're the priests. So what else do we know about the priests?
They were in Judah,
They were in Judah. They're in the
in charge of
southern
the
kingdom.
temple.
They what?
They're in charge.
They're in charge of the temple.
They're fighting for centralization.
Absolutely. And
Aaron is the.
sacrifices. Aaron is going to be the Levites and Aaron, right? And their whole big thing is about covenantal relationship. Why, Barbara, do you think the priests rewrite this story? Why do we need this story again in chapter 6 when we got it so nice and so beautiful in chapter 3? Barbara, this is your question.
Tell us who you
More than that? You take a step further. Why do they want to make sure that they get to control who wrote the Bible?
yeah, well, they're the priests.
And therefore,
They want to be in control. They want to.
they
But it's
believe that
money.
they're, huh?
Isn't it to the priest, isn't it money and riches and recognition and, I mean, there's a lot of reasons.
I think it's what Barbara said. They want to be able to control the tradition. They want to have the dominant voice about how they understand how to live the tradition based on what Adonai wants. Understand the covenantal relationship, yeah.
I told you this before, one of the reasons I really dislike the idea of saying Old Testament, New Testament. Is the Testament is another word for covenant.
Yep.
And saying New Testament means that covenant that you Jews had with God
Is over.
is over.
And now we
And
got a
now
new
we
one.
have a
That's
new
right.
one.
That's right.
And
Well, that's
I
exactly
find
what
that
they're
sort of
saying.
difficult.
It is totally difficult.
Exactly.
Yeah, Jerry.
Could you explain what you mean by they became a people after, when they left Egypt? They weren't a people before that?
Yes and no. Sorry, that was Jewish. How do we refer to the people of? How do we refer to the people in the patriarchal period? I'm sorry, Rose, that I have my back to you.
B'nai Yisrael.
B'nai Yisrael. Which literally means what, Jerry?
Children of
The
Israel.
children of Israel. And when we're talking about the children of Israel, who are we talking about?
The sons of Jacob.
The sons of Jacob. How many sons does he have?
12.
He has 12. This is actually the introduction of something we call tribalism. Oops. Yes, we have it in Judaism as well. And so much of what we see over the course of the Torah is the tension between the tribes. They each have their own identity, they each have their own mascot, they like to stick together. Yes, they all kind of rally around a central place, the tent of meeting, the tabernacle, etc. But even when they settle in the land of Israel, every tribe gets its own spot. They get their own land. By the way, where are the priests going to be? Which is in Judah, right? Within a particular tribe. After we leave after we leave Egypt, we're not only known as B'nai Yisrael, we're also known as Am Yisrael. And Am means what, Jerry?
Well,
People.
didn't Moses say, "Let my people go"?
Yes.
Well, those are my people.
Shalach et ami v'ya'avduni, right? Let my people, this Am, go free.
He didn't say it.
He doesn't say this, right. By the way, just take one look quickly at the very beginning of chapter 1 of Exodus. Look at the way that the Torah introduces the second book of the Torah. It's very, very clear.
What page?
Page 317
Or 119.
or 119. The opening verses of the book of Exodus are very clear that when they go into Egypt, they are the sons of Israel. And not only are they the sons of Israel, they'll spell it out for you. We've got Reuben and Simeon and Levi and Judah and Issachar and Zebulun and Benjamin, blah, 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 blah. When we go into Egypt, we are tribal. When we leave Egypt, we become a people. And what makes it so special is that we've all coalesced around a particular thing, namely our relationship to God.
When they were living in Israel, were they, in Egypt, were they tribes? Were they
No.
living separately? And
Not, I mean, they
Egyptians didn't see
They
them.
did have unique, they still knew, I think, kind of their history, their ancestry, but I don't know that they were living distinctly as tribes.
And the Egyptians saw them all as one.
Correct, as one people, that's right. But
the Exodus marks a transition between a people living under subjugation,
Yep,
surrounded by non-Jews,
yep.
and becoming a people who become their own independent nation.
That's right. By the way, when you become an independent people, what are the typical things that you need to mark your independence?
The ruler
You need a ruler
and laws.
and laws.
Land.
You need land. These are all things that happen as a result, as a consequence of the Exodus. And you need one other thing.
Lead you.
Yeah, on two levels. You need a figurehead, that's Moses or Aaron, and you need a God. You need a God. And Moses is saying, when he goes to the people, he says to God, who am I supposed to say is the God that wants you to leave? And he gives them all kinds of answers. The God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, El Shaddai, Adonai, Elohim, all of these different names, ultimately settling once again on Adonai. By the way, if we go back to chapter 6, after this whole covenantal thing, after we get this whole thing that he needs to take the Egyptians out of slavery, the Israelites out of slavery, all of the words of redemption, I want you to look at page 354, verse 14, which in the text, actually we can start even a couple verses earlier, in verse 12. And I want you also to look at the freedmen on 128. So after we have the name of God in its true form, after we have the reminder of the covenant, there seems to be a pause in the text, an aside. Verse 12 says, but Moses appealed to the Lord, saying, the Israelites, they wouldn't listen to me. How should Pharaoh heed me, a man of impeded speech? So the Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron, and in regard to the Israelites and Pharaoh, king of Egypt, instructing them to deliver the Israelites from the land of Egypt. And then we have this weird pause. The following are the heads of the respective clans. Does everyone see that? Stan, would you mind reading, starting in verse 14, and go through verse 25?
For Freeman?
It doesn't matter.
Okay.
Is everyone looking at Freedman or looking at the red one?
Yes.
Freedman? All right, look at the Freedman. Everyone look at the Freedman. Verse 14 through verse 25. This is an aside in chapter 6, on page 128 of the other book. Do you have the other book, Rose? Go ahead.
These are the heads of their fathers' houses, the sons of Reuben, Israel's firstborn, Hanak and Palu, Herzon and Carmi. These are the families of Reuben, and the sons of Simeon, Jemiel and Jamin and Ohad and Jachim and Zohar and Saul, and son of the Canaanite woman.
One of the first baby naming books, right?
Yeah. These are the families of Simeon, and these are the names of the sons of Levi by their records, Gershon and Kohath and Merari. And the years of Levi's life were 137 years. And the sons of Gershon, Libni and Shammai by their families. And the sons of Kohath, Amram and Ishar and Hebron and Uzziel. And the years of Kohath's life were 133 years. And the sons of Merari, Mali and Mushi. And these are the families of Levi by their records. And Amram took Jochebed, his aunt, as wife, and she gave birth to Aaron and Moses for him. And the years of Amram's life were 137 years. And the sons of Itzhar, Korath, Nepheg, and Zachri, and the sons of Uzziel, Mishpael, and Elzaphan, and Zethri. And Aaron took Elithibah, daughter of
Aminadab.
Thank you, Aminadab, sister of Nashon, as wife, and she gave birth to Nadab and Abihu, Eleazar, and Ithamar for him. And the sons of Korath, Asir, and Elkanah, and Abisaph. And these are the families of the Korathites. And Eleazar, son of Aaron, had taken one of the daughters of Putiel as wife, and she gave birth for him to Phinehas. And these are the heads and the fathers of the Levites according to their families.
All right. So let's pause here for a second. What on earth,
Nicely done,
well done.
Sam.
What did the text just do?
It established Aaron.
That's exactly right. No, more than Aaron.
It's the sons of Aaron.
It establishes the
Kohite.
tradition of the Levites and the priests. All amidst this whole story. Finally, Aaron knows, Moses knows, they have a job to do. Moses knows the real name of God. We have a weird random insertion in the text that literally outlines the first sons, specifically Reuben and Simeon, right? And Levi. And then we have a whole understanding of who the different sons are of Levi, getting us to Aaron and Moses, to who their parents were, Amram and Yocheved, and even further to the lines of Aaron, which include his sons, Eleazar, Itamar, and Pinchas, all of whom will become high priests.
Right.
Why do we need this? Why do we need this in the story, and why do we need it now?
Because these are going to be our leaders.
That's right. They're going to become a people, and if you're going to have a people, you need to have a God, and if you're going to have a God, you need to have leaders. I want to set up right now for you, and very clearly, under the priestly authorship, who is going to be the political leaders of the people. Now, Ellen, you should ask your question again. That was not the question that you should ask again. What do we have for dinner? No.
Where's Riku?
Why do we need this again?
Right. Because we had some of this.
We
earlier.
did. We had this whole story in a slightly different way. Everyone, please turn back to chapter 2 of Exodus. I'm on page 321 in the red Chumashim. I'm also on page 120 in the Friedman.
Well, doesn't this come to something what Barbara keeps wanting to do, is bringing it back to who wrote?
That's
And
right.
you can't take it out of this section of not understanding why, because it's sort of like the priests have to put that in
That's
to clarify.
This is where the political and the theological come
They
into
come
tension.
together.
That's
Yeah.
right. Right? Friedman says that chapter 2 is J. But you'll notice that the story is very similar, except there's a major difference. I'm reading in Friedman on page 120 now. And a man from the house of Levi went and took a daughter of Levi, and the woman became pregnant and gave birth to a son. She saw him, and he was good. She concealed him for 3 months. She was not able to conceal him anymore. She took an ark of bulrushes for him and smeared him with bitumen and with pitch, and put the boy in it and put him in the reeds by the bank of the Nile. His sister stood by at a distance, not knowing what would be done. And Pharaoh's daughter went down to bathe in the Nile, and her girls were going alongside the Nile. And she saw the ark among the reeds and sent her maid, and she took it. And she opened it and saw there was a child, and there was a boy crying. This is one of the Hebrew children. And so she talks to the daughter, and she says, find for me a maidservant, or a midwife who can nurse her, and she names him Moses. Okay? How is the story similar to what we just read in chapter 6, and how is it different?
This story is just a Levite.
That's right. It's a random Levite,
And
and
in the story that we went to, it's the priests, it's Aaron, it's
That's
the
right.
Kohanim.
lest you think in chapter 2 that it's random Levi, the priests come in and say, this is not random Levi. And not only is it not random Levi, I want you to know very clearly the lineage of who these people are, how they became the leaders of the people, and how they're going to take you out of Egypt. The priests have a very specific process that they're going through in order to establish seniority. The priests are, we said that J, is J early or late? Anyone remember?
Really?
It's early. The priests are later. So if J is an early source tradition, and the priests are a later tradition, what is the goal of the priests in writing this text?
They have to
Like set themselves up.
establish.
They're setting themselves up. Exactly. So I can't answer Barbara's question, who wrote it, because each time it gets written, someone comes in and rewrites it or redacts it because they have a goal in mind.
Or an
chapter.
agenda.
Say again?
Or an agenda.
Yeah. By the way, the priests totally have an agenda.
Yeah.
And there's a secondary agenda here too,
Yeah.
which is there is some scholarly work that shows that Moses was Egyptian, purely Egyptian.
Yep.
It was not Hebrew at all. His name Moses, like Ramesses, it's a completely Egyptian name. And he had the staff, and then that was gone, and there was this battle for a Mosaic line, which was not Canaanite, it was purely Egyptian. And the Aaronic line, which was Canaanite in origin. And you can see it if I can direct you to Exodus, where you were just 6:13,
Yeah.
354 in the red. When Moses talks to God, he said, "The Israelites will not listen to me. How then should Pharaoh heed me, a man of impeded speech?" And according to Friedman, what he means is thick of tongue, I think is a literal translation, is that I don't speak fluently in Hebrew, I speak Egyptian, and I need somebody who can speak to the Israelites for me. So
Right.
there's that kind of element to this as well.
Yep.
But the rabbinical people don't want any Egyptian origins of our religious faith.
That's right.
So they have, yeah, that's it.
No, yeah, I think you're right. And I would say that to Barbara's question, the story gets rewritten in order to present the story that we want to present.
Yes.
Which, by the way, is different than saying, nope, we got it all, God gave it to us, we're done with it, we just take it as is. This adds in a whole other layer that perhaps the authors were being very intentional, very crafty. It's kind of like the writing of a bill in Congress. They write a bill, usually the first version is fairly pure and straightforward of the things that they want, and then what happens? They amend it. But what's my favorite word that they do is they throw pork into it. Okay, because that's a very kosher thing to do. They put pork into it, which means what?
Profits for them.
They add stuff, right? They want, well, I'll vote for your bill if you put some, construction project in for my town, right? Because I promised my constituents that I would do whatever. And then what ends up happening is that people decide, I can't vote for the bill anymore because you have made it so full of all of these other things that I'm not even going to get what the original intent was anymore. And in a way, the Torah does the same thing. Here's the first version, but you know what, it's not clear enough, so I'm going to add a little bit more. Oh, no, you know what, I really wanted to say this, so I'm going to add a little bit more. And until it's canonized, it's actually not set in stone. Julie and Bob.
So, those who believe or know God by these other names and, have different political agendas,
Yep.
would they object to, somebody else's version?
They might.
Yeah.
But they
And who
won't
do you believe?
necessarily erase the versions. They will amend them by putting in verses on either side, right? If you look at Friedman, for example, you'll see that there are verses that are in the back, whatever you want to call it, the highlighted text. If you look at who the author is of that, it's R. Who's R? That's right. It's the redactor. There was some other unknown anonymous editor who came in and smoothed the whole thing over to make it read like it's one long narrative.
And it pleases everybody.
Because that's what we try to do in the Jewish world. We try to please everybody.
That's right.
If you read the way I read verse
Yep.
5,
What chapter are you in?
6.
What page?
6, verse 5?
Yeah, it says, "And also I've heard the cry of the children of Israel as Egypt is enslaving them, and I've remembered my covenant."
Yep.
Whenever I read this, I think to myself, what took you so long?
Yes, that's a really great question, which is theological in nature. And you could make the argument from the priest's perspective, what took so long is that the people needed to remember what? The people needed to remember that they were part of the covenant too. The covenantal relationship with God was not one-sided. We had a part to play in it as well. And the priests are all about not just the fulfillment, the perpetuation of the covenant, but how do you fulfill a covenant? What do you have to do? Follow the laws. And who become the people who help create the laws? The priests. That's right. So the authorship becomes more complex because there's a particular agenda and a particular goal in mind in terms of establishing the relationship with God, whatever name of God it is.
The beginning.
Do you understand why it's italicized?
I don't remember off the top of my head.
It's other,
Which one?
some
Which
unknown,
It's other, it says it's other at the top.
Oh, it's other,
Yeah.
okay, thank you.
Other, but we don't.
It's coming from the Book of Records.
Alter unknown.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question as to why do we need to put this in here. By the way, this is, for those of you who like other biblical trivia, this text, chapter 6, verses 14 through 25, becomes the basis for the family feud that takes place between Korach, Moses, and Aaron. So the big Korach rebellion that happens later, where Korach says, why do you get to be the priest? Why do you get to be the leader? I want in too because I'm your cousin. We have all of the family lineage right here. This is the breakdown of all of the Levites. There's a good reason why Korach is upset. Why is it that only that side of the mishpacha got the inheritance and my side of the mishpacha didn't get the inheritance?
Why are you the big priest and I'm the janitor?
That's right. That's right. Exactly. That family lineage right here is telling us, it's setting up what's going to happen later, but it's also laying out for us who has the authority. Yeah.
Beginning of Exodus, you list the 12 tribes.
Yep.
Where's Dinah?
She didn't get inheritance.
She didn't get an inheritance, but do we know where she is?
I mean, like where she hung out.
Is she with them? Did she go wandering off somewhere else? We don't know.
They weren't interested in telling her story.
Right, I understand that, yeah.
That's right. We don't really know, and we know that in general women do not inherit land,
Right.
with the exception of the daughters of Slavcha, which, by the way, comes several generations later, and it's because of the daughters of Slavcha that we rewrite the inheritance laws.
And that's in Deuteronomy.
No, it's at the end of Numbers. It's in Pinchas. It gets discussed once again in the book of Numbers, in the book of Deuteronomy, but it's in Pinchas. All right. Did I thoroughly confuse you all? Yes, I did.
I was mixed up when I came in, now I'm confused.
All right.
It's just another name for the same.
Exactly.
Well,
Befuddlement,
Mixed up has certain attributes.
it would be worth a conversation, which we'll get to at the end of the class, which is, does it matter? Okay? Does it matter who wrote it based on the interpretation? Does it change things? But as we see now, there's a lot of different agendas, right? We're starting to get into the political pieces of it.